So I want to begin today with an imagination exercise. I want you to imagine you're standing someplace watching a tremendous storm come in. You're on top of a hill. So maybe the hill country of Texas or Kansas, or maybe this is a hill in Galilee or Judea. But you close your eyes and imagine the storm is coming. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Oh, Lord, my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds, his ministers of flaming fire. One of the great joys of life is taking a moment to worship a God who is glorified by creation. Creation is not God. God is much greater than creation, but creation points to him, to his glory, to his sovereign power, and to his wisdom. So here in the second week of our Foundation series, we want to rejoice in the Creator God, the Creator King. All the ancient creeds begin with this truth, Creator of heaven and earth. The Free Church Statement of Faith that we read last week, in the same paragraph that talks about the Trinity, says that we believe in one God, Creator of all things, having limitless knowledge and sovereign power. We see his limitless knowledge and sovereign power in creation. And we'll see it today in Psalm 104. This is a great text, one of my favorites, one of the most beautiful creation texts in Scripture. Now, from time to time, when we look at a text, we notice what biblical scholars call a chiasm, where the initial point of a block of text is matched by the final point, and the second point is echoed in the next to last point, etc. Scholars love these things, and they sometimes make them way more complicated than they need to be. But this psalm, slightly simplified, really fits the pattern. We see in Psalm 104, first and last, that God is glorified in his creation. Second, that he is sovereign over his creation. And third, centrally, that his wisdom is displayed in the working of creation. So the verses we just read, 1 to 4, are the initial statement that God is glorified in his creation. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord, my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty. This is God's glory, his greatness, his splendor, his majesty being seen. Now, a biblical definition of glory is a bit hard to settle on. The word itself, not used here, but used later in the psalm, literally means heavy. The heaviness in the literal sense of the crushing and in the figurative sense of profoundness. That's God's glory. It's profound. It's heavy. But my definition has always been that God's glory is the radiance displayed by any of his perfections, the heavy light that surrounds God's perfections. Here it is creation itself that displays this heavy light. Verse 2, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. Notice that this verse reflects day one of creation in Genesis. The author of Psalm 104 had his quiet time, not only on that stormy hill, but meditating on the first part of Genesis. And there are echoes of this throughout the psalm. Notice also that the light and the heavens display God's glory. The Sandra McCracken video was based on these verses.
Call him good, my soul. I am here to declare my affection for you. Call him good, my soul. You who are wrapped in glory, dressed in greatness. close, sunset and moonrise. For a tent, you stretch out the heavens. For a roof, you pitch the sky. Call him good.
Verse 3, he lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. There is a sense of God's presence, God's coming in power. Now, the direct thought of that verse is day 2 of creation, but the implication is that creation has a purpose, that God creates not just to display his glory in the abstract, but to come and to show it to created beings. Verse 4, he makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flaming fire. He comes to show his glory, and that's point A. God is glorified at his creation. Point B, he's sovereign over his creation. Verses 5 to 9. He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. This paragraph reflects Genesis 1, 9, and 10, day 3 of creation. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called the seas, and God saw that it was good. By God's power, and at his sovereign command, the lands of the earth were separated from the waters of the oceans. This is sovereign power. He's the one who set this world on its foundations. He covered it with the waters. At his rebuke they fled. At his thunder they took to flight. He appointed the place for the mountains and the valleys. He set the boundaries beyond which they will not pass. When we look at creation, we should, and perhaps we must, stand in wonder and in awe of a God who is infinitely powerful and sovereign. But these verses also remind us of Noah's flood. I think whoever authored the psalm intended to remind his readers of the sovereign power of God in both events. One of the phrases that points us toward the flood is in verse 6, you covered it with the deep as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. Genesis says, and the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. So God's power is shown not only by the creation of the earth, but by his acts of judgment and, of course, rescue. Verse 7, at your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. God says to Noah, never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So point B is that God is sovereignly powerful as shown in creation and in his sovereign subsequent acts of judgment and rescue. Point C, the center of the psalm, which is usually the high point of these things, it emphasizes his wisdom in the ordering of creation. Verses 10 to 26, long section. I have to ask you to kind of imagine yourself in a mountain valley and follow this story down to the sea. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them, the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nest. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers. He made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness, and it is night, when all the beasts of the forest creep about. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work, and to his labor until evening. Oh, Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. The thing I love about this psalm is that it depicts in poetic language what scientists call the water cycle. Wikipedia says, the water cycle, also known as the hydrological cycle, describes the continuous movement of water on, above, and below the surface of the earth. The sun, which drives the water cycle, heats water in the oceans and seas. Water evaporates as water vapor into the air. Ice and snow can sublimate directly into water vapor. The water vapor molecule, H2O, is less dense than the other atmospheric gases, so the water rises. However, as altitude increases, air pressure decreases, and the temperature drops. The water vapor condenses into tiny liquid water droplets, and a huge concentration of these droplets over a large space becomes visible as clouds. In the clouds, particles collide, grow, and can no longer be supported by the air. They fall as precipitation, rain or snow, sleet or hail. On the land, a portion of the water runs off to form streams and rivers. Some infiltrates deep into the ground and replenishes aquifers, which can store fresh water for long periods of time. But some of the groundwater finds openings in the land surface and comes out as springs. Over time, all this water runs down to the ocean, where evaporation returns it to the water cycle. The water cycle, Wikipedia says, is essential for the maintenance of most life and ecosystems on the planet. And the psalmist knew all this thousands of years ago. Though not in academic words, but he knew what academics have forgotten, that the wisdom of God designed all this. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them, the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. The groundwater, the rain, the springs, the surface water, these are the engines of life in God's great ecology. Verse 14, you cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, bread to strengthen his heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests, the stork has her home. The high mountains are for the wild goats, the rocks are for the badgers. Everything, plant and animal, depends on this water for the abundance of growth. And on them, in turn, the whole complex of animal life depends. And from this complexity of life, plants and animals, people, mankind, is supplied with food and wine and bread and livestock. God designed it all. And it's not just this water cycle, but the seasonal cycle, the day-night cycle. Verse 19, he made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness and it is night. When all the beasts of the forest creep out, the young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food. When the sun rises, they steal away and go and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work, to his labor until evening. Sorry, I get so caught up in the scientific accuracy and the wonder of this that I drift away from the main point. But the psalmist doesn't. Verse 24, O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. God did it in wisdom. He's not only sovereign in power, he's unfathomable in wisdom. And by wisdom in this context, I mean knowing how to do things right. We normally define biblical wisdom in human terms, skill for right living. But for God, we use another word, omniscience. He knows everything that can be known about everything. So his wisdom is knowing everything and then doing the right thing and doing everything right. That's our God. That's what we see in creation. Verse 25, here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. The water cycle ends, or begins, in the sea. From here we go back to the first verses of the psalm. Remember, the psalm is chiastic. It cycles back to the clouds and the storm and the rain on the mountains. But this is only one of thousands of processes the Creator God designed in wisdom for his creation and for us. This one was especially visible to the psalmist as he meditated on Genesis and on the storm. But God has allowed us to see his intelligent design, his wisdom in so many things that we, above all people of all ages, we are without excuse when we do not turn that seeing into praise. I could give countless examples of the wonder and complexity of creation. One that has been on my mind is the wonder of human development from conception to birth. I ought to sit down and let you watch most of a TED Talk called From Conception to Birth. I've edited it a little because of time constraints, but I've included a good deal of the commentary, and I want you to listen for the word divinity. I don't know the beliefs of this man, Alexander Tsiaris, but if I understand it correctly, when he says divinity, he's saying God had to have made this. Only in his wisdom could this incredible wonder have happened. Listen to it.
I was offered a position as Associate Professor of Medicine and Chief of Scientific Visualization at Yale University in the Department of Medicine. And my job was to write many of the algorithms and code for NASA to do virtual surgery in preparation for the astronauts going into deep space flight so they could be cut in robotic pods. One of the fascinating things about what we were actually working on is that we were seeing, using the new kind of scanning technologies, things that had never been seen before. I mean, not only in disease management, but also things that allowed us to see things about the body that just made you marvel. I remember one of the first times we were looking at collagen, and your entire body, everything, your hair, skin, bone, nails, everything is made of collagen. And it's a kind of a rope-like structure that twirls and swirls like this. And the only place that collagen changes its structure is in the corner of your eye. In your eye, it becomes a grid formation, and therefore it becomes transparent as opposed to opaque. So perfectly organized a structure, it was hard not to attribute divinity to it. One of the opportunities I had was one person was working on a really interesting kind of micromagnetic resonance imaging machine with the NIH, and what we were going to do is scan a new project on the development of the fetus from conception to birth using these kinds of new technologies. So I wrote the algorithms and code, and he built the hardware. Paul Lauterborough then went on to win the Nobel Prize for inventing the MRI I get the data. And I'm going to show you a sample of that piece from conception to birth. But as you can see, when you actually start working on this data, it's pretty spectacular. And as we kept on scanning more and more, working on this project, looking at these two simple cells that had this kind of unbelievable machinery that will become the magic of you. And as we kept on working on this data, looking at small clusters of the body, these little, pieces of tissue that were the trophoblast coming off of the blastocyst, all of a sudden burrowing itself into the side of the uterus, saying, I'm here to stay. All of a sudden having a conversation of communications of the estrogens, the progesterones, saying, I'm here to stay, plant me, building this incredible trilinear fetus that becomes within 44 days something that you can recognize, and then at 9 weeks is really like a kind of a little human being. The marvel of this information, how do we actually have this biological mechanism inside our body to actually see this information, the magic of the mechanisms inside each genetic structure saying exactly where that nerve cell should go. The complexity of these, the mathematical models on how these things are indeed done are beyond human comprehension. Even though I am a mathematician, I look at this with a marvel of how do these instruction sets not make these mistakes as they build what is us. It's a mystery, it's magic, it's divinity.
Amen. It's divinity. It's God at work. The creation is a mirror that glorifies God. In sovereign power, he rules over it so that the complexity and order of creation ought to cause us to marvel at his wisdom. Unwinding the chiasm very quickly, we return to the fact that God is sovereign over this, and then to the initial truth that all of this does bring glory to him. Verses 27 to 30, these, all the creatures he's made, look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they're dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. These few verses emphasize that a sovereign God is the source of life for all these creatures, the authority over death, the giver of new life. The psalmist says that all creatures look to God for their sustenance. If God does not actively provide, there is no provision. God did not wind up the universe like a clock or program it like a computer and then walk away to leave it to run. Hebrews tells us that Jesus Christ upholds all things by the word of his power. Creation is not set and forget. God is actively involved in maintaining, even in continuously creating his creation. And so, verse 29, when you hide your face, they're dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. God is sovereign over life and death. And life again. Verse 30, when you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Genesis 1 attributes life, especially the life of man, to God's breath. But the word breath and the word spirit are the same. The spirit gives life and renews life. And it's not out of the question to think that verse 30 is looking past the death of the creatures to the restoration of life, to the resurrection of men and women, to renewal of creation, to the new heaven and the new earth. God is sovereign. And the last point is, of course, the first. God receives glory from this creation and from us as we contemplate it and meditate on it. Verses 31 to 35. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works, who looks on the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. Let sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. The glory of the Lord is the light of all his perfections, and especially here, the light of all of his works. The light of this perfection will be praised forever. He himself, the psalmist says, rejoices in his works. Remember how God described creation day by day. It is good. It is good. It is good. It is very good. Is there any doubt at all that God, like every creator, rejoiced in what he has made? And he still rejoices. Despite the fall, despite the brokenness of all his creatures, he rejoices because he writes the end of the story, when there will be enough to brokenness and when all things will be made new. The Lord, who is filled with sovereign power, rejoices in his creation, which has the good sense to tremble at his glance and to burn at his touch. And we, too, should tremble. God receives glory not just from rocks and hills and stars and seas, from perfect processes and miracles of design, but he receives, or ought to receive, glory from us, the ones made in his image, the ones capable of highest praise. So the psalmist says, I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. The psalmist looks back over what he has written, over what he has studied, over this quiet time on the hill in Genesis, and he offers praise and song and rejoicing to the Lord. He's looked at this creation in some detail. He's done the hard work of engaging with God, seeing his wonders, and that is what led him to praise. And the psalmist himself, as we did several weeks ago ourselves, cries out, enough. Let sinners be consumed from the earth. Let the wicked be no more. But then he calls himself back to praise. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. So do you see what this is calling us to? We should engage our hearts and our minds in the study of creation and in wonder. We should engage. Whether it's divinely designed processes like the water cycle or the growth of a baby, or the simple beauty of a leaf, a flower, a forest, a mountain, the black depths of a starry night, we should see and rejoice. We should see and glorify the sovereign God who does all things in perfect wisdom.